Okay, this is Patricia Wakida, and I'm back at Josephson, and this is October 30th, 2020. My first question is, how did you get into book arts? How did you end up in that world?
That's such a tricky question. I would definitely say that it starts from being a reader. It starts from being somebody who has cultivated love for reading books and physically touching and getting lost in the narratives as well as the pictures. But to take it to a practical point in my experiences, I went to Japan my senior year when I was a Mills student and spent only a semester there. But I happened to really fall in love with paper while I was there. And I hadn't really quite been mindful of the fact that I just hadn't quite put together the connection between the history of the papermaking and the crafting of the papermaking to the book and all of the amazing things that go behind that. I had not taken a book arts class at Mills while I was an undergrad, which is very stupid. I know it's really like blow my brains out. But so I came back from that semester abroad and having learned, or let's say awakened to curiosity in papermaking, because I didn't do any then, but I went back and I spent the next year and a half in Japan. And during that time, I weaseled my way into um, meeting up with and spending time working with the traditional paper maker in the area of Japan called Mino, um, where traditional paper makers once had like mass villages, and you could see historical photographs of the chestnut boards sitting outside their farmhouses with washi paper drying out on there. And I spent, I don't know, a couple of months making handmade paper with this person and freezing because there was no heat, and they don't heat the water that you're working in, and you're beating fiber, and just learning so much about light and fiber and paper. And then I had made this huge stack of paper with this paper maker. And one night he was like, I gotta go, take some care of some visits in Nagoya or something. So I'm gonna go and you'll be here. I said, that's fine. He's like, oh, by the way, I have a huge roll of linoleum over here. And I said, what's that? And he cut off a piece of linoleum for me and sat me down and just said, just carve and remember everything is opposite. And I said, okay. So I spent several days after that. And I mean, literally, sometimes I was just working by candlelight because there really wasn't good electricity in that house. And I taught myself how to do linoleum stuff, which is really my main medium now. So I took some of the linoleum he gave to me, and I still have some of those first blocks. They were terrible. And I really didn't understand the application of the backwards very well. The negative and the positive, and a huge stack of paper, which I still have some of it untouched, but most of the paper I've used now in a project. And I realized I needed to do something with it, which was put narratives on it and put images on it. And I came back to the Bay Area, finished my, graduated from Mills, and I found an apprenticeship here in Berkeley with a letterpress printer and linoleum block carver. And they were called the Arts and Crafts Press. And they don't live here anymore. They're in Tacoma, Washington area. But I learned a lot from them too, because it was the first time I'd ever been on a press. And at that time, the woman who was kind of the main brain behind, or she's still the main brain behind the press, was carving most of her stuff by hand. She's now moved a lot to plates, or she'll work with wood blocks. But I learned a lot from her too. I learned a lot about color, for one, and then also how to work on a press, although in very sparing amounts of experience, because she was she's Japanese. Yoshiko Yamamoto is Japanese from Japan, and she pretty much wasn't going to let me touch anything. Like, my job was to clean and to paint the floor and to maybe cut paper. And actually, that's the worst thing to start an apprentice out with, was cutting paper, because you can ruin paper. You can ruin a whole ream of paper in an instant. And I have done it, as you can tell from like my expression and the way I'm telling this story. That's like the last thing you teach people to do. Anyway, so I got a little bit of experience working on her CMP platens, and it really got me interested. And so I just kept getting more and more involved. I just found other people with presses that I could either do swaps with. I started volunteering at the San Francisco Center for the Book, doing PR work for them. And eventually I found my way to Mills again when Kathy and Julie were saying that we need TAs. And at that time, the TAs were open to the public. So meaning that people with experience could apply for it versus the English grad department as it is now. So that's a super fast forward, I mean, I also have been on the board of the Pacific Center for Book Arts, and then I was on the board for the San Francisco Center for the Book, and I teach. And it just kind of snowballed. I would really say that a lot of it is community, because there are so many skills that I don't have. I'm a terrible bookbinder, as even the whole paper cutting episode is so related to it. Like, it's really a technical thing that you have to be so exacting and perfect. I suck at that. I get glue everywhere. It's like everything's crooked, and that's the last step in building your book. So it is very much a cry-worthy thing when you ruin all the work that you put into it because it's just not quite right. And there's nothing you can really do. You can't take it apart because you can see all your mistakes, or the paper, the paper is not that forgiving. No. So I've learned just watching other people who are in calligraphy or binding, or, all the other different types of applications of imagery onto paper and other materials, and just being part of this book arts community in the Bay Area has been a real gift. And there's a very, very strong community here. So, and a lot of it stems from Mills. I have to say that Mills really gave birth to a zillion really cool people who have continued to be mentors for others.
Yeah. Is there something about book art that that like felt like it was appealing for your work? Something specific about it, or?
That's I mean, I guess, again, I think it has to do that it is kind of like a container, but also a mirror to the whatever you're thinking about and doing. It really goes back to the book form, because you could put anything into it or on it or around it, or, like there's something about it that allows you to just put your ideas into it. But I will say that from the very beginning, I didn't know what I wanted to say. So that's why I think that's why I took to making the paper. Because I didn't know what needed to go on the paper yet. Right. So just doing paper making for a couple of months, and then like I was so in love with the paper, but I didn't really know what to do with it. But then I started listening and, talking to people and listening to them talk about ink and type on paper, and paper is all water and it being light. And it was just profound, right? It was just this beautiful thing that I still didn't know what I wanted to say, but I had a lot to learn from really great book designers, or people who are really into type and printing, fine printing, that just resonated so deeply when you really start looking into the history of the book and falling in love with the beautiful books. It's just hard not to be like, I want to do that. So, and maybe it's also, I like that books are compact, that you can make multiples. I think that there's some kind of like, not exactly democratic, but something really generous about the fact that it's not a single painting that you don't replicate. You're supposed to replicate it by and large. I mean, of course, there are unique books where there's only one, but my style has always been like, make many, staple it onto the telephone pole, like give it away. So, and there's something about this nature that, the format, I should say, that really encourages that, especially in its history.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really great way to say it. I know you said primarily you work with like linoleum block and printmaking now.
Right.
How do you see book art in your work now, where you are as an artist now?
Not so much. I really, really, it got to this point. So the beautiful thing about when you're in a space where like Mill's studio, the book art studio, where you have access, is that you can play and you can do things and you can do all this stuff. And then when you step away from it, you don't have the tools and the equipment. And it can really make a big, big difference. So for a long time, I was like, well, I'm going to share studios or I'm going to do things. And then when I was T at Mills, I was obnoxious. I was there all the time. I was there in like the dead of night, like security coming around, looking at my car and stuff. And I can't do that now. And so that really kinds of narrows things. It makes you kind of narrow things down. And again, I was a terrible bookbinder. So in some ways that kind of already like took that off the table, where I tried, and I even like a really great bookbinder, he was a friend, once hired me to do stuff, and I messed it up so bad. It was like, okay, not only am I like, I don't pay me, I think I owe you a present, I'm going to bring you a cake. Like, that was terrible. I'm so sorry. I just not only wasted your time, but I think I ruined some stuff. Anyway, that really helped me make that decision that actually getting to the binding stage is probably not going to be in my future. So I've done some broadsides, but to me, broadsides really are much better if you can lay type. I mean, sometimes I'm a purist, really. I don't really like to use polymer if I can't help it. I use polymer. I try, sometimes I've been using polymer for the past couple of years, every year for my calendar, because who's going to set the type for the freaking calendar with no, right? And it has to change. It's not something that you can just drop in. Although I have been trying to do more tricky things, like last year, I bought those little tiny calendars, where you rip off each little page. But if I do a broadside, I really want to use the metal. And I can't really do that unless I go to the Center for the Book now, right? So that kind of explains it. Essentially, not a lot. It's really come down to me making prints and cards, and I also print my linoleum now on shirts and stuff like that. So, but I still do it. I do it a lot. I've gotten a lot of commissioned work this year. This year was a really interesting year with like tons of new commissions from people I have no idea who you are, right? Like, okay. So
interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. You never know. Where is this coming from?
That makes sense, though, about, the materials and not having the tools, it makes it very hard.
Right. And it's accumulating space. Honestly, like if you wanted to be a bookbinder, like a really good one, you need to have clean space, clean. And the press is dirty. And then you also have to like have room to have all the cloth, like huge bolts of cloth and all the, your tools and blah, and buying all that. And it's like, no, I ended up choosing like, I need space for drawing racks, for example. And that takes a ton of room, as well as flat files and stuff, which is a different storage method, I think, than for books, which you can, when you're done, you could actually put them on shelves, but the paper, not always. Like, the prints, it's like a different whole thing. And it's a lot of inventory. It's a lot of protection. And, if I'm going to mail them, how do I do that? Anyway, I think I've just chosen a path, stuck to my lane.
That said, do you feel like the ideas of book art is still coming into your work?
Probably, because I'm really around a lot of book artists still. Like, I'm really good friends with book artists still. So, including people who are printmakers, paper makers, and bookbinders at the same time. So, and they have very, really little space. So they would kind of debunk everything I just said. But it's just some people just have the proclivity and the talent to be able to do all three kinds of things, like to make the paper and then create, do some carving and print it and then have space for the press and then also be a really clean bookbinder. I'm influenced by them because I look at their work. I go regularly to see the exhibitions at the Center for the Book. And it is true that like over the years, I am probably less in love with when, I'll go to an exhibit and I'll see things and sometimes I'll find something that sets me on fire. But I think I've become much more of there's two things. When you go to an exhibit, you can't touch the book. So I think that is just the way it is, right? And you can't really fall in love with it the same way. But I've become such a visual person where I'm looking to see like who's doing block prints, like that I'm just loving what they're doing with this, and how the text works. And it's like you kind of need time and a certain intimate space to be able to sit down and read whatever it is that they're putting together. So it's less likely that I'm like really completely won over by something new that I've seen. It's like, has to be so visual, right? For you to just stop in your tracks and really spend time with it. And it's hard to do that. And I think it's hard to do with books, period. So even if I go, let's say, to Mills's special collections and visit Janice Braun, and honestly, most of the times I ask her to, like, you pull things out that you want me to look at. And even with that, I'll find one thing that I'll really look at and want to take pictures of. And a lot of times, again, you don't have time. So you're really looking at layout. You're looking at how the page looks, the spreads and just the feel of the rhythm of the book. That also too, I'm also still involved in trade book publishing. So I see the influence, trickling down, and I can definitely see when a book is just not well done. Right. Yeah. And I mean, I always do think back to Kathy. I mean, Kathy really had an influence in me in understanding just the book design starts with the typography on the page and the amount of white space and how that's actually really pretty geometrical. And people don't understand that because the designers are so trained to work on the screen, and they don't, you can see it. You can always see it when people don't understand margins. Right.
Yes.
And they also don't really understand the rhythm of a page either, like pacing out a book. So, and I am picky about that when I talk to people about the design. I don't design books myself, interiors of trade designs, but I do a lot of editorial work for people. And sometimes they'll self-publish and look for a designer. And I'm like, has this person had experience in book or at any kind of print design? Because you also have to understand what it's going to come like from your screen to the, ink on the paper. Do you understand paper? Right? Do you understand the bindings? So these are really, are influences that I still carry with me.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. As far as like writing goes, you said that a lot of your books have written like the word in them, and I had a question about your book, Poems to Eat. I know those are Tanka poems, translated Tanka poems. Have you written Tanka poems yourself?
No, never. I've written some haiku, but that was back in college. I don't think I've really written poetry since really pretty much right after college. But I still write. And for example, I am working right now, and I'm like, it's right over here. I have two things that I'm working on for the Japanese American newspaper here in San Francisco. It's called the Nichibei Times. So one of them I'm working on is something about community cookbooks. Like, it's an article on community cookbooks, which is so rad, right? Like, what a great topic.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Well, I went to this, they made me go to this panel. Well, they invited me to go to this panel, where one woman talked about her research on community cookbooks. And then they did a thing where these elderly women, there were 4 of them, did a cooking demonstration, but they had done a little video with them. So it was like a Zoom thing for COVID times, but it was so adorable because then they all did a cooking demonstration. And then they came back as a panel and we got to ask them questions about cooking and recipes, but all 4 of the women, the elderly women, had done some sort of a family cookbook or a community cookbook, or, right? So they were talking about how these cookbooks often have recipes, but also family photos and memories and stories and just, jokes and weird things like that. So it's a really interesting topic, actually.
It's fascinating.
It was such a delightful thing. It really was a fascinating thing. And then the other thing I'm writing right now is another panel I just attended via Escondido Public Library on Japanese Americans in graphic novels. What a great topic, right? So I got to read a million graphic novels and then listen to these people speak, and they had so much to say about publishing. That was so interesting. And I kept sending questions. I was the obnoxious person that took over the entire chat thing, because I was curious, well, why, does it matter? Especially if you're working with Marvel or DC and you're writing content, and, what's about the artist versus the writer? Because you could write something, and if the artist isn't JA and doesn't understand it, we really got into it, and it was so fascinating. So I would say that so much of even that writing from the book arts time, it kind of is similar, because if you look at Poems to Eat, it's Japanese, it's using Japanese text. And even though these two things I just described to you are Japanese American, I haven't strayed very far from my content and what I really like. And that book, by the way, I can remember sitting in the studio and like trying to find that thing again. It looked so great before I found it. And I liked my idea, but I was not able to carry it through. So it was like this big chunky book. And I used like a heat press to adhere the film onto the board. Looks terrible. Every single one of them is wonky, like beyond wonky. They look terrible. And then I tried sanding them to make it more even. It's too bad.
It gets to that point where it's like you're trying to save it and it just nothing's working.
No, I'm like sanding away the content because I'm trying to make it look even. Duh.
Still such a cool book though.
I enjoyed making it, like, again, like for the pages and everything. And I'm glad that I did the chunky book and everything like that. That was right, because it wanted to feel like like a sandwich or something. But I just was not the binder to make that happen. And it was really fun. The photos are real photos. And, I set the type and printed that onto that paper. And yeah, no, it was a really cool book. But again, I ruined it at the binding stage. I have never exhibited. I have never really, that does not get seen by the public.
Kind of tucked away. Yeah. I guess, I think in your website bio, you mentioned being dedicated to the narrative. And I guess both in like books you've made previously, but also now, even when you're not using text in your work, how do you feel like that's coming through your work?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on the project when I really think about it. I mean, I'm thinking about the last couple of things that I've done in this year, like even 2020. So one of them, I've been invited to illustrate somebody's book. So that, even though the pictures, and this was the first time I've ever done this, so it was really, really, really hard for me. And some of them I kind of really want to redo. You are creating narrative through the images, right? Like, even though, and it was a decision for me to make, like, is it really exactly telling what's happening on that chapter? Because those chapter books like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where it's like you turn the page and it really is, that's what's happening right now.
Right.
Or do you do something broader? Right. And do you have to have an image for every single chapter header? Or, what I mean? Like, there were decisions I had to make like that. And the author helped me decide that really it needed to be a little bit of both. So it needed to kind of convey something that's happening in the book, obviously, but it could be a little bit looser about where it was placed in that chapter. And we also made this decision, or maybe I made the decision with his encouragement, to think about how they would sequence if they were on a wall and an exhibit. Like, how would you still be interested, and would it be able to tell a story on its own? And this is by no means at all a graphic novel. Like, I have no idea how those people can do that. I mean, those are people who do graphic novels are just beyond geniuses, because the amount of artwork you have to do, the illustration you have to do. And I can see from lining them up that it's wonky too, like in terms of the sequencing and the flow, because I'm still used to just doing one thing and then one thing and one thing. And so this was a really big challenge for me. Fortunately, I do have time, because we found a publisher and it's not due till 2022. Yay. So I could redo stuff, and I'm fast once I start going, but it's been a real interesting process for me. But most of the time it's like people will just say, we want this one thing. Another example of this is like, so I was commissioned earlier this year by a health, like food product place, again, like health product. Anyway, they wanted to develop this, like these organic safe pills. God knows, I have no idea what this thing is, that like is kind of like caffeine that you're taking in pills, like helps your brain feel like more, alive and energetic or something like that. So they wanted an illustration that was like the brain was like really having a good time and like, but not high. I don't know. And we went through so many iterations of drawings of that, of like gears turning and stuff, even though I was like, that's super cliche. That's what they wanted me to do at first. And then I showed them that it was so cliche. Like, we don't really need to go there. But you still need to be able to tell the story of what it is that they're trying to say, right? Like, what is the message here? What's the energy? What's the feeling? What's the emotion? In just one single image too, whether it's like a full narrative or not. And certainly there are ones that I've done that were like, you could tell this is a story. You can tell this is a journey and something's happening. And certainly you could even do a drawing where you could see a character moving through time and place. But I don't know. To me, what I guess I mean is that a graphic narrative can be purely decorative and absolutely mean nothing except for, let's say, it's just a flower, which I do, right? Or it can be something where there's one of my most popular prints that I've ever done is a girl sitting at a typewriter typing, and it says bird, and there's an image of a bird, which is weird because your typewriter actually can't draw a picture of a gull. And then you can see off the page there are origami cranes flying off of the page, right? I want to actually do a shout out because I did that for my friend Susan Ito, who I met at Mills College when we were both, she was a grad student, I was an undergrad, and she teaches ethnic studies now at Mills College. So there's like, and it's like she was working on her chapbook, and I just kind of went through all the stories and found the one that really resonated the most with me. And I essentially did an illustration for that one story. But it's very narrative in its feel. Like you can tell that there's something it's a story. It's a story.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't even know if I answered your question because now I'm just rambling about birds.
That was great. Yeah. So when you're thinking about, I suppose some of your examples have already kind of touched on this, but when you're thinking about what stories you want to tell, do you find yourself coming back to the same narratives, the same stories?
Maybe. Again, I think, and it's taken me a long time, even though it seems like I've been in the same kind of path. In a lot of ways, like as I've been creating work for my Wasabi Press imprint and honestly trying to sell it and make a living, I've kind of gone over the line where I'm like, okay, these are things that are popular, like flowers and animals and flora. And I actually really enjoy doing that anyway. It's just, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I do that's like that. On the other hand, what I also plug into really naturally, and there's a market for it too, is the whole Asian American narratives and images. Like nobody really is doing very much with the Asian zodiac, but all of us, it's like the horoscope. We all relate. We all have an animal that we're born into, and every year it comes up. Right. And I was like, it took me forever to be like, marketing wise, like, what should I do and try to sell on my Etsy? My calendars sell out every single year. Granted, I make very few of them because I do everything by hand, right? So everything is still letterpress no matter what, right? And lino. I haven't started my ox one for this year, and I'm kind of in trouble because it's so late. But you never know. I might pull something out of my butt, especially since the Center for the Book just reopened by appointment only, so I could rent space again on their presses. Because I have an etching press at home, but it is like, forget it. It's so slow. I just want to crank these guys out. And then when it comes to like the writing narrative stuff, it's, honestly, the Japanese American story is pretty deep. There's so much behind. Well, there's the immigrant stuff, but there's the camp thing is so huge, and there's so many interesting stories around that connects to current stuff. And it's just, I have a soft spot for the elders in my community, and I just love hanging out with them and I love doing oral histories. And there's been an interest, so both the Japanese American newspaper in LA and the one here in San Francisco have hired me to write for them over the years. And then I write for, it's all historical. I write for an encyclopedia, an online encyclopedia about the Japanese American incarceration experience called Densho. I do editorial work for the Japanese American National Museum. It's, in some ways, it's a little bit of survival and what's the demand and the need. I think as a fourth generation Japanese American, I'm a little bit rare that I'm so interested in this history. Most people in my generation are not that keen on JA history and the past, but I'm really, really, really into it. I did not intend to go this direction, and I have a bachelor's degree. That's it. I don't have a master's, I don't have a PhD, so I'm a little bit weird in my field because I'm not an academic. I've never taught on campus and everything. But there's a lot of freedom in that too, because like when you choose a path like this and you can say, okay, well, this is my specialty and I do read every book on this topic, it is kind of, and yet it's still so big. It's kind of nice because you know that what you're qualified for and you know what's interesting to you. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just the work that's kind of chosen me and I've chosen it. I do definitely go back to the same content a lot.
That makes sense. I think that's something so instinctual about just needing to keep coming back to the same thing and going through the same story. It feels like almost it has to happen, I feel like, in
Right.
some
I mean,
ways.
I suppose the well will dry at some point, but like, I just showed you like the idea of doing this thing with the cookbooks, community cookbooks, it really wasn't even my idea. And the graphic novels was just like, but actually there is a really interesting way to look at this through these lens, because for example, with the graphic novels, these are all artists and writers. I didn't create that content, but I could really appreciate what they're doing. You could definitely see how their Asian American, specifically Japanese Americanness, came through. The characters were Asian American. The storyline sometimes had directly to do with camp. Some of them really were about being Asian American, growing up and going to Japan and getting completely lost and having so much identity turmoil, which I've experienced myself. So they were so specific to being Japanese American. And it's like, well, yeah, this is not random that I've been asked to cover this piece and I can ask them questions that are relevant. Plus, I've been publishing. So the publishing questions really excited them too, because they're like, well, it's not that there are so few publishers, but the marketing, like, yes, you're right. A Japanese American would really appreciate reading this book, but how do you market to, how do you find that plus your regular one? And editors. And I thought that was a fascinating point. I hadn't thought about that. Like at that early stage, they're working with editors who have no idea what they're talking about. And it really does make a difference. Like they were really kind of upset. Two of the speakers were really upset about how much essentially time is wasted trying to explain yourself to someone who has so much power at that stage. And I thought that was really, really, really interesting. And then going back to the cookbooks, what was interesting was that and it makes so much sense. Duh, I never thought about using them as a primary source to see like what's happening in the community. Like going from this is what's popular and then influences, like you can see when like maybe you're borrowing, sometimes they even tell you like borrow from Mrs. Jameson next door and something. It'll be her apple pie recipe that this Japanese American woman has adapted and then submitted to the cookbook thing, which are almost always churches and temples, right? So it's the Japanese Christian or the Japanese Buddhist temples and their fundraisers. And then they have like sections on celebrities, like, Asian American journalists and politicians submitting their recipes. I don't know. There's just something so very intimate about it. And I can read it and understand it like in a different way from somebody who doesn't know, right? Who these people are, what this is all about, why, suddenly you see a certain ingredient shows up a lot, why there are 12 versions of fried rice. I don't know. There's just so much Jello. It's a really interesting history of the community because you see them still making these things today and stuff falls off, right? I mean, that's true of cookbooks everywhere, right? In terms of trends, but it's especially interesting when you look at it through the JA lens and what they all submit, right?
That's fascinating. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time.
Yeah, I'm into it. So hopefully it won't die off soon in terms of content and material for me to work with.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound like it at all. This has been great. Thank you so much.